recording this. So I know you for a very, very long time, since I was a PhD student, and you were this phenomenally brilliant, both methods person and social psych researcher. And I remember I'll never forget that, like, you used to share with us really fascinating research about intimate relationships. And I think you did a lot of that type of research. I think it was like around maybe 2006, 2008. But since then, it seems like you've taken your research also to new directions. So maybe this is your opportunity to also introduce yourself, like share a bit of what you've been thinking about, what's been
what I've been up to. Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting that you remember the close relationships work, because that's actually where I came from. So I came from a lab that studies relationships. And I think the reason why I really study intimate relationships was because I was interested methodologically in pairs of people. And almost no one who studies dynamics in the workplace or these kinds of things, like, took really dyadic approaches that was really kind of started in the intimate relationships world. But then I kind of moved on to studying intergroup relationships. So, between people who come from different nationalities. So I've run studies in Abu Dhabi where we bring people in and they come from different countries, and we highlight the human development index of their country to manipulate status and things like that, which is fascinating, and looking at how that affects how people negotiate. So if you're kind of crossing these, global lines, you're from Norway, how do you interact with someone who's from Pakistan, for instance, or, Sweden? We get a lot of kind of Middle East, Europe types of interactions. But what I've done in this work is also just kind of applied some of the tactics we know in close relationships that work. And that's actually kind of what I try to do in my book, is take what we know works to, bring up something about your husband or wife that you don't like how do we have these confrontations in marriages, and then apply it to these, harder, more tenuous relationships that we didn't necessarily select into, like with a boss or coworker or someone from another country that we're trying to negotiate with and make a deal with. And I actually think there's a lot to be learned from those relationships. We just rarely apply it because we think they're so different in kind that it wouldn't work, but it actually works really nicely. So, we do studies in my lab on small groups and negotiations. We study a lot of the difference between how people behave and what their physiology says about what they're feeling. And we often see this kind of interesting mismatch of physiological stress responses. So things like increase in heart rate, blood pressure, sustained over time. But when you ask them what they think, they're like, I love this person. We had a positive interaction, and then you code their behaviors and you see what we call friendly overture. So kind of the bending over backwards effect. You see this a lot in the US, less in Israel, at least in my experience being in Israel, where people kind of throw a bunch of positivity, like, yeah, things are great. But then they're leaking out signs of discomfort and anxiety. They're a little bit stiff when they do it. They avoid eye contact. So at least in the US and other Western cultures, we're not so great at being straight shooters. We don't really say what we feel. We don't give feedback the way that we should. We're not clear communicators, but our bodies often indicate what we're really thinking and feeling. And so we get this kind of interesting mismatch. So a lot of what we do in our lab is actually try to understand that mismatch and try to align them as much as we can, because the person with whom you're interacting can always tell. Right? If you're really stressed, they can sense it. If you're prejudiced, they can feel it, but you have no sense of how much it leaks out. So, we put people in these different kinds of interaction contexts, like negotiations and persuasion, to see that mismatch, often in workplace contexts, like giving someone feedback, giving upward feedback to someone who's your boss or manager, these kinds of things.
So this is fascinating, because a lot of time when we meet early stage entrepreneurs, for example, and they really want to impress the investor, and they're, like you're suggesting, they're caught in this challenge between the communication versus the nonverbal. So oftentimes, right, they want to kind of sense, is it really leading to an investment, let's say, or is this, just diplomatic, polite behavior. Right. So what can we give them in terms of just heuristics or,
kind of just key little takeaways? I think, you're familiar with the negotiations literature. So there are all these ways of like information seeking and stuff like that. I think, insofar as it's possible, you want to avoid having these meetings over Zoom if you can. I've written a lot about hybrid. I have a piece in the Wall Street Journal on this that really
Wow.
talks about how when you're in Zoom, you
Mhm.
miss all these nonverbal signals that you're talking
Mhm.
about that are really important. And kind of the most important one is eye contact. So we
Mm.
have this illusion of having eye contact, but Shira, you cannot tell if I'm staring at myself right now, or I'm looking at you, or I'm like looking somewhere else around the room. And the research shows most people actually just stare at themselves. They keep selfie on. So we're missing that. And eye contact is a huge signal of interest and being on the same wavelength. I mean, Talia Wheatley, who you might want to talk to, also really
Mhm.
shows that when you have dyadic eye contact, that
Right.
really helps communication go smoothly. So I would say try to get people in person. And then I think when you have these interactions, you need to, as much as you can, kind of follow a script that really just gets very clearly at what information you're seeking out and when. I
Mhm.
think the tendency when we feel nervous is
Yeah.
to go off script and talk about things that make us comfortable but aren't necessarily relevant information, particularly for potential investors and things like that. And you want all your interactions with all your potential investors to go kind of similarly so that you don't have an apples to oranges comparison going on.
Mhm.
It's kind of the same rules we'd apply to kind of any interview context where you're trying to seek out that kind of information. You want to ask the same questions in the same way of everyone with whom you're talking to or trying to
Mhm.
persuade. And that way you're able to actually kind of gather more data on what it looks like when you say X. So, say I come to you and say, we have this great new app we're trying to sell.
Mhm.
It can identify whether two people are going to be attracted to each other in 6 months just by looking at a photo of them or something. And, we've already done the training data set and the testing data set. It's going great. And you give this speech 9 times, and 9 out of 9 times they start to wander, their eyes wander the minute you give the speech. Then you have more data that it didn't work. But when we do it differently each time, we don't
Yeah.
know what about our speech or our pitch is failing.
Yeah.
But people have a tendency to just kind of go off cuff and say things in different ways. So it's very
Yeah.
hard to get that feedback. And I think this is true in general in the workplace. If you give talks, if you give presentations, you want to be consistent and get data from multiple people so that feedback is actually relevant to the same thing that you're doing each time.
Got it. I have to ask you because I'm really fascinated. I was started to being fascinated with the whole jerks kind of literature when I had an experience where I was caught between a rock and a hard place, and in different work situations, I had to deal with jerks, and I didn't have the power or leverage um, to kind of
Yeah.
speak up or I would say find an adaptive solution for working with jerks. I have colleagues in Wall Street, like who worked in Wall Street, who just quit their jobs, or junior people who studied with me at Columbia at the time. And I think we were really caught between a rock and a hard place, because you really wanted a job, you really wanted to impress your boss, you really wanted to perform, but at the same time, you're really suffering. So
Yeah.
I'm really curious what led you to kind of, hone on this important research question.
Yeah. I mean, I would say it depends on sort of the nature of the jerkery and, were they neglectful, were they micromanage, or these kinds of things. But the number one thing that I think people often have intuition about that isn't always right is that you should confront or complain about your jerk at work. And then when they're higher status than you, above you, hold power over you, that just becomes like an impossible endeavor. And so most of the advice I give is kind of more about a workaround. Yes, sometimes you will eventually confront, but even when you do that, you almost never lead with the problem behavior itself. You almost always kind of back into it or kind of sidestep into it by having a different conversation that you then kind of layer the problem on. And then, and I'll give you an example of that. But the other piece is half of solving these problems isn't about confronting the jerk. It's about kind of building a social network of people who aren't your best friends, who are allies that are well connected, that can help give you a reality check and kind of help you, either plan an exit or get backup. And I think kind of to go to the first thing I mentioned of confronting, most of the time you can't actually go to someone and say, you're micromanaging me, you're smothering me, or you ignore me, or you're mean to me and your feedback is too harsh. But you have to kind of think about what the consequences of that behavior are. So for instance, with a micromanager, which is the most common management strategy, you don't want to go to the person and say, you're smothering me. You want to go to them and have a conversation about how you feel like maybe your goals aren't aligned with that person. You see yourself going this direction, and they seem to see, or they at least treat you like you're going in a different direction. And it could be the case that they're micromanaging you because they don't feel like you're doing a good job at work. Or it could be all this other shit that I talk about in my book that gets kind of piled on them. Either way, your goal is to get those, short-term and long-term goals aligned, and then come up with an action plan of how you're going to achieve them. It's very clear. Then you want to have short 15-minute meetings with them kind of once a week rather than avoiding them. So you never actually call them a micromanager. Don't ever use the language, but you talk about the bigger problem, which is you have a goal to get promoted in 3 years. They have a goal to micromanage you. You're never going to get there if they keep on this path. How are we going to kind of align these goals with each other? And I would do the same for lots of different problems with bosses, where calling them the thing is just going to piss them off, threaten them, potentially ruin your letter of recommendation. We dealt with this in grad school where that golden letter gets disrupted. So I think you just have to think very carefully about sort of what that back or side door approach is going to look like.
So if I translate it to kind of like the everyday business lingo, at least amongst Israeli who are very direct and have a lot of chutzpah, is don't call your boss a jerk or an ass or directly, but try to find ways of more talking about alignment of goals or strategy.
Alignment or goals. I mean, the other thing, and this comes from the close relationships literature, is if you do want to confront them, make it first start, if you can, with something that they're doing that you want to see more of, that you actually like. So rarely are we actually ever told, I don't like this thing, but I love this thing. Can you do more of that thing? And if you kind of open with that, and most people have some form of silver lining, assuming they're not like a sociopath, micromanagers give you a lot of feedback. Not everybody gets that, so kind of lead with that. And then when you do the sort of but part and you criticize, be very specific about the exact behavior they're doing, not how you feel about it, and not what you think it says about them. So, you don't want to have any kind of ad hominem, oh, this means that you don't trust me, or, you have a hard time letting go, or these kinds of things are all kind of just, I don't know, interpretations of the behavior, not the behavior itself. You don't want to assume that, because you don't want them defending, no, it's not that I don't trust you, and then you're having a conversation about trust. Well, that has nothing to do with the problem. Maybe it does, but it's not actually solving the problem. So you want to say specifically, I love that you give me great feedback, but it would be great if we could come up with a plan of, how long you expect me to take to respond to an email, because 20 minutes feels a little fast. That's like the particular behavior. Or I get that you work on the weekends, but it's really hard for me to respond to all your emails on the weekends. Can we come up with a game plan of sort of to-dos and to-don'ts, or whatever? And people tend to be more receptive if it's about a specific behavior and not like them as like a concept. Super threatening, when you get criticized as a person. But when someone says you did this little thing that's fixable, they get less defensive.
Very, very interesting and very pragmatic advice for managers. The other thing that came, at least as a narrative in conversations with a lot of students this year, is this kind of like, quitting culture, this idea of, if this doesn't work for me, I have many students who just dropped out and went on trips to Ecuador and
I was just talking to Jay about this, because we're like, what's going to happen to all these people that like feel like something's minorly off, and so they just quit?
So I'm trying, and a lot of the kind of like these org psychs were like, trying to highlight why it's important to actually stick to a job or a position, even though it might be really annoying or it might be really challenging. So why should they even, why is it so important to actually stick to your work or
and try to solve it instead of running from it and finding it? Okay. So there's a couple of reasons. So just practically speaking, from a purely self-interested perspective, if you have a difficult problem with someone at work, that you're in the majority, and no matter what job you have, that's going to happen. And so it behooves you to try to fix it now, or at least learn some strategies for repairing it, because the next job you go into, you also don't get to select who you work with, right? maybe it'll start nice, but we have very little control over who our colleagues are at work. And so chances are you're going to see it again. So it behooves you to try to solve these problems now. I think just from a growth perspective, my guess, and there's no data to support this, is that people who do this, and we see this with the Great Resignation, that, you know, you don't like the culture, it's toxic, you leave. We're going to see this kind of whole group of young employees making a whole bunch of lateral moves, you know, maybe 4 or 5 in a year. Well, they'll just hop from company to company and start over because they don't like the culture. Whereas the people who aren't doing that are making horizontal moves. They're going to slowly climb up, because we know the best way to get a raise or promotion at work is actually to do it within company. Companies almost always hire within, at least big ones. Startups are obviously different. And yes, you can get like scooped from a recruiter or whatever. But most of the time, leaderships are promoted from within because we know what we're going to get, and we're just much more comfortable doing that. So if you're making all these lateral moves, you're going to find yourself holding the same position for 5, 6, 7 years, whereas someone else who started at the same time as you is going to make a bunch of horizontal moves. And I've actually seen this happen. So one of my friends from graduate school, Janet On, she left academia to industry, and she now works for Mind Gym. And she just stuck it out. There was a lot of contention. She worked through it, and now she's the president, you know? And so she kind of climbed the ladder super, super quickly, partly because she was so efficient at troubleshooting everyday problems at work, not just between her and other people, but between her team members at different levels. And because of that, the CEO promoted her to president of the Americas. So here she is, you know, making over $1 million 5 years out of her PhD. And not that everyone has those opportunities, but I compare her to people who also graduated the same year as her, who have kind of held some middle management position. I mean, they started out kind of in the middle because they had a PhD, but as you know, you don't get much real experience in PhD school. But they didn't like their boss, or one of them felt like she wasn't getting projects that were, you know, good enough for her, or she, you know, she got slapped on the wrist a few too many times for gossiping and things like that. And she's still at a pretty low level for someone with her degrees, number of degrees and years out and stuff. So I really think it's a problem if people just want to think about their own career growth to hop from job to job, because you can't troubleshoot, or, you know, it's not entirely your fault, but you don't try to at least troubleshoot some of these things. And it'll be, I can't wait for like whatever giant study comes out that looks at people who are in the Great Resignation who are doing this, you know, hopping from job to job. I mean, I'd be curious what you think, but that's kind of my intuition. You're going to see a whole bunch of these lateral moves, and they're in 10 years out, they're going to be the same role that they were when they started.
I agree. It also seems like you're suggesting that the mere experience of dealing with conflict, right? The trying different strategies, the constant kind of, you know, opportunities to solve problems or to actually develop your skills in these positions in the same organizations are those who ultimately lead to like successful moves.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, the longer you stay in an organization, the more you become known as an advice tie. So people come to you because they know you know how to get shit done. You can figure it out. You know what days of the week the boss is miserable. Don't talk to him that day. Don't talk to her. And the days that they're great. The longer you stay at a place, the more you develop that information. And then once you become known as an advice tie, then you're granted voice in meetings. You know, then your boss comes to you and asks you what they should do at the end of things, and you gain status really, really quickly that way. But if you don't stay at a place very long, you never become an advice tie, you never are granted voice, it actually makes it harder for you to deal with people like credit stealers and bulldozers who take over meetings, because half of kind of the trick of dealing with those folks is offensive strategies, not defensive ones. It's being seen as so important and having such a valuable opinion that when you speak up, everyone listens. So it's really hard to bulldoze you and interrupt you. It's really hard to steal your ideas because they stick to you. And these things are sticky. But when you hop from job to job, it's like starting over at a new high school where no one knows you after you became prom queen at the last one. Shit, I have to start from day one again, learn how to have voice, learn how to become an advice tie, you know, develop a social network. And there is a real kind of process loss there that people often don't consider. They just think of like the gains of starting somewhere new where they think the grass is greener, but all that like soft power stuff is completely gone. You have to completely start over. And that's actually what helps us get ahead at work.
So you're highlighting important also issue that's coming up, at least now in Israel. There's skyrocketing salaries for high-tech employees because there's just now so much demand from employees and there's not enough human capital. So employees and managers are now doubling their salary if they can just move from one company to the other, doing the same exact thing.
Yeah,
a lot of them just think about the dollar sign. They're thinking about the monetary outcomes. And you're saying, wait a minute, before you're jumping the gun to like even double your salary, like what are you're saying there is a loss? You know,
there's a loss. And I would say for companies that do that, so we obviously have that problem here. Silicon Valley has a major vest and rest culture where these people, they're thrown tons of money at them because they're engineers and they're really good. And then they just sit on their ass and don't do anything and collect a paycheck. And no one really thinks about the loss of that. So companies often fall in love with these geniuses, but then they don't put steps in place to make sure they don't become free riders or lazy. And there's a huge process loss there too, not just, they're not producing, they're paying them to not work for the competitor, but they're not producing work. But it creates a contagion within the organization of laziness and bitterness among those who are paid much less and working twice as hard. So there is a culture loss for bringing in too many of those people. I mean, we saw this. Google would scoop everyone, pay them 1.2 million to sit on their ass just to not work for the competitor. And they'd spend the whole day with all these like failed like Google Lab, things. And it's a real problem. I mean, the company loses money, but the culture really takes a hit. And then they have a really hard time getting those go-getters who are a bit like diamonds in the rough that actually just need to be trained up and aren't the shining stars. And those are the real people they need to keep because they're cheaper, they do more work. You can't have all these shining stars that sit on their ass and do no work, but here we are. I just with like Slack and stuff, the bitterness just spreads like super quickly when you have this level of inequity in a company.
Wow. So your research is right on time to hit inflation and really changing job market. What could be advice that we can give potential recruiters or the hiring managers to filter out those free riders from those who are really keen and interested in contributing to the organization?
Yeah, I think these are great questions. I think it's really hard, and the research shows that you can't really detect a ton from an interview. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, but you can ask them questions around how comfortable are you with like very explicit processes, about sort of keeping track of work and things like that. So, I talk a little bit in my book about how critical it is for free writing that everyone on a team at the beginning of a project comes up with a list of what work they plan to do. And then at the end of every week, you ask everyone if they did any work they didn't plan on initially doing and what was it. Eventually you see patterns of who free writers are. Free writers tend to do really well in conscientious teams because they can get away with it and everyone picks up the slack. But if you ask questions in an interview, you say things like, okay, in our teams, just for pure transparency to make sure people get credit and everyone's doing their share, here's what we do. We have everybody kind of commit to what their part of the project is. And then at the end of the week, we do these kind of check-ins with rotating roles of who's doing the check-in. Are you comfortable with that kind of thing? Free writers will be like, oh, I get away on charisma alone. Like now you're telling me I have to actually do work. So you can weed people out who are uncomfortable with really transparent processes about what they've done and when. And also managers who meet with all of their direct reports, even if it's just for 10 minutes. And so they don't actually hand off communication to a more senior person who could end up being a real jerk, right? And then that person kind of becomes a liaison. So they also need to be comfortable with kind of short, frequent meetings where the manager asks very specific questions about, who's doing what at work and things like that. Those I think are kind of the main things that you want to fish out. And there's other little things you can do to kind of make sure you don't have someone like a kiss up, kick downer who tortures everyone at the same level, but are nice to the boss. But it's mostly about transparency and everyone's actions and what they're doing and record keeping. And jerks who know they're jerks hate record keeping. It's like, it's the bane of their existence. They don't want to have their shit on record. So the minute you tell them that we actually keep track of everything here, then they get nervous. Yeah.
Yeah, it resonates a lot with these team projects that we did this year over Zoom. And then there were, like you're suggesting, there were a few jerks in the teams. And then definitely when it came to like the 360 review evaluations, everybody noted who the jerk of the team was. Very honest.
And the funny thing is, there's this great research on free riders on teams over Zoom. I think someone at a management school did it. And even if you show them evidence of their free riding, they won't admit it. So don't expect these people to like fess up, because unless they're really backed into a corner, they're going to completely deny it. You know, to the point where it's like embarrassing for them. And you're like, just stop, just say I didn't do my share, you know, but it's just self-protect, I think.
Well, it's useful to know that, you know, what to expect, like in terms of expectancies, what to expect from these free riders and jerks. So when you're, you know, if you had to give your, how old is your son now?
He's 8.
8. Okay. So if you have to give it an expectancy of what the workplace would look like in the future and how to best prepare, you know, kids to dealing with different kinds of jerks at work.
Yeah. What would I say? Well, I actually had this conversation with him yesterday because he came to me and said, "Oh, mommy, my teacher's a micromanager." He obviously listens to me talking. I'm like, "What do you mean? What did she do?" Well, she just nags at us to do the work and then tells us we don't get to do recess if we don't do the work. So I had a conversation with him about perspective taking and what is motivating her, because it's just not natural for him to kind of naturally engage in that. So I explained to him why she cares about them doing well in school, you know, and what that means and what that motivation is. And it did help a little bit, but I do think, you know, he tells me jerk at work stories all the time. Like, someone stole my Lego house idea and claimed it was theirs, or this one kid dominated circle time and like totally took over like share time. This, you know, it's funny, like the strategies I talk about work on 9-year-olds and 8-year-olds too, because
So
they're
yeah, that's
really
what I was
basic.
saying.
They're like communication stuff that we like should have learned when we were growing up, at least in America. We just never are taught these like really basic communication skills of like how to perspective take, how to ask for feedback, how to like, you know, confront someone who you think is stealing your idea. And our intuitions suck. You know, they're usually combative or avoidant, but nowhere in the middle. So I'm working with it, but I can definitely see the like nature, and I'm like fighting against.
Right. So if we're thinking about interventions, what do you think, at least in our spare time or opportunities, also maybe outside of work, that we can develop potentially these communication skills? So can we also do it? Yeah.
You don't have to just do it at work. I mean, if you have a family member that you have conflict with, that you're ending in an impasse over something, the same strategies work there. And in fact, a couple of people have told me that like they've used them in their marriages and it's actually working really well to like get past some disagreements and stuff like that. So I do think you can try them out. You can practice them, you know, with each other at work. But I think the main thing is that don't, you know, try these strategies. Don't expect them to go perfect the first time. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of work, like everything. But don't get scared off if you feel like it was more awkward than you thought it would be, or you said some stuff that you regret, and you know, you tried to criticize, but you ended up over complimenting instead because you freaked out, you know, like whatever it is, you just have to really try. I try stuff on my kid all the time.
I love this.
I gaslit him the other day and told him it was like 2 hours later than it was because I wanted him to go to bed. I'm like, I know how to gaslight because I wrote a chapter on it.
Where did he learn this word? I only learned it when I was 30. I don't know. This is like,
it's like very advanced. Like he's always accusing me of gaslighting him, and it doesn't even make sense. It's just like, he also tells me to have a growth mindset. He doesn't know what he's talking about, but it's weirdly in the air, even with little kids.
I love it. Okay. Well, they're definitely turning into young managers very early on. So I'm expecting my next manager to be maybe 20.
Oh 15. God, yeah. Well, we could have a whole conversation about age differences and workplace and stuff like that.
Yeah. But I wanted to thank you for your time, because I know you're extremely busy and you're not with your book launch, and I'm sure you have a lot on your plate. And I would really love to, you know, recommend your book and have people, I don't know if you have additional resources or opportunities to connect with you, or I don't know if you're doing any webinars or.
Yeah, if you go to my website, it's tessawestauthor.com. I try to update the events on there that will just say like if there's some free event or something, or if there's videos, I post those as well. So as stuff comes up, I can certainly just kind of like shoot you a quick email and be like, this might be of interest to your people.
So what's the next book on?
I want to write a book on breaking up at work, like how you actually break up. You know, you leave a job, you dump a boss, you dump an employee, because I think we're also bad at that.
Yes. I gave my boss at Merrill Lynch this book, like of Viktor Frankl, like Man's Search for Meaning, when I had to like.
You're like, go search for some meaning because you're missing it.
And they're like, sure, what does this book mean? Like, why can you write the letter? Like, you know, just like, it's too emotional for me. I can't talk about it. I can just give you a book. It was too emotional.
You write the letter. Yeah, it's hard.
It's hard. Breakups are hard. Well, I had a lovely time talking to you, and I'm sure we're going to meet in the near future. Not on Zoom, I hope.
I know.
Yes. But I'm very excited to hear about your stuff, and and keep training that 80-year-old to be the next CEO.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Good night. Bye.
Bye.